Welcome to Bespoken AI Podcast. Press 1 for the latest news in voice AI. Press 2 to start the show.
Hello, welcome to the Bespoken AI Show. We're building this podcast to dedicate to the news and history of voice AI. My name is Diego Sandoval. I'm the head of business development at Bespoken.
And I'm John Kelvey. I'm CEO and co-founder of Bespoken.
And in this few episodes we're launching, we're going to be covering a variety of topics, the developments in voice, AI, agents, and we have several headlines to discuss. But we're also going to be covering what we're learning along the way, some takeaways that we have with customers, our engagements with conferences. But to kick things off, we want to talk about what's been on the news this past week. And the first one on our list is Salesforce acquiring Fin. For those of you not familiar with Fin, it was formerly known as Intercom, and it was recently acquired for $3.6 billion to enhance Salesforce's Agentforce platform. For those of you not familiar with the Intercom core product, you're probably seeing these widgets on the websites that open up a chat, either connecting you with real people in their team or with a custom agent that is resolving your issues. So lots to talk about on this. I'm curious what your thoughts are in it, John.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting story. This is at least partially sort of an inspiration for the show, because when this happened, I was practically kind of grabbing people on the street to discuss it. I thought this was a really interesting acquisition on the part of Salesforce. They're not traditionally someone who is, closely associated with voice AI, but they're definitely a company that, I watch and I think most people watch, and certainly has made a lot of noise about AI, and has been touting their Agentforce for some time. So then when they acquired Fin, which we knew was Intercom and used as Intercom, I thought that was pretty interesting. And really, there's a few parts to it that I thought were interesting. One is obviously just the part of where, it does look a bit redundant. So, Agentforce, we've heard a lot about it. I think certainly part of it is it's meant to be used for customer support, and so is Fin. So it's like, well, why did they need this? And I do think part of the story there, or that part of the story, I think a lot of people had questions about that. I looked at the stock price for Salesforce. It's been, a little bit less than 30 days since this acquisition was announced, and it's down 20%. And I don't think that's just the Fin acquisition, but that's a pretty remarkable loss of value, given how much Salesforce is worth. So I do think it did shake people's confidence that Salesforce knows what it's doing from an AI perspective. I guess another aspect of this, though, that I would say that's perhaps a bit more optimistic about it in terms of what Salesforce can get out of it is, what you hit on there, Diego, which is, Fin does have this sort of valuable real estate in terms of interacting with end users. And so, Agentforce, maybe it can do all the things that Fin does, but it doesn't have that immediate reach into end users, which, even though it's relatively easy to install these products, the fact is getting onto everybody's web pages, I do see it a bit less often now, but getting it onto everybody's web pages, that's a non-trivial thing. I mean, that does take time. And so it then becomes this beachhead for Salesforce to presumably push Agentforce a lot more and to push their AI strategy a lot more. So I guess, that part seems a little bit more optimistic for Salesforce, and to me helps make some sense of it.
I think as a go-to-market adoption, I think that's a good point. I think it was something around, I don't want to butcher the numbers, but several 100,000 customers that Fin is bringing into Salesforce, and where now Salesforce can deploy their capacity into those front-end pages. And I would like to entertain, just for a minute before we move on to our next headline, the story of whether this is an act of desperation and what context is in there. I think it's worth noting that there was an opportunity to acquire Sierra, which was started by a Salesforce executive, Brett Taylor. They've been growing massively in the last 3 years, acquiring a good chunk. I think it's about 40% of Fortune 500 companies, if not Fortune 50. I'd have to look into that stat again, but just rapid growth. And for whatever reason, they didn't acquire them. So was this just the next best move they could make?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, well, one, yes, I think that this does look like a little bit of a consolation prize, because they were not able to acquire Sierra or reach some sort of agreement to merge or tie up it does look like Sierra has been so successful at fundraising and getting early traction with customers that, that no longer really made sense for them. And, I don't know if Mark Benioff thought that that was sort of always going to be an option for him, or it was going to be an option for a bit longer, and then it sort of got away from him. I don't know, but it's, Brett Taylor has a legendary reputation at Facebook, at Salesforce. He's on the board of OpenAI. I mean, he's a luminary, I would say, in the technology field. I think almost everybody would agree with that. And so that looks like a bit of a missed opportunity for Salesforce. I would also say that, I think it's interesting to bring up Sierra because that is a subject. There's certain themes that we want to return to as we're talking on this podcast. And I think Sierra is definitely one of the companies that we have our eye on. We don't have a news story or anything to talk about them this week, but, to me, they are in this new firmament of voice AI. They are a major, major fixture. What they have done, still at a very early stage. I don't think, they're going to by any means just run away with enterprise AI. I mean, it could happen, but it's hardly written in stone at this point. But they've taken a great early lead. I think they seem to have done a tremendous job. And I guess it's unsurprising given the reputation that Brett Taylor has. I mean, he seems like a very capable executive.
It's going to be really exciting to see, the next couple of years where Sierra goes. But I think that's a good segue for our next headline, Siri AI. I know you're a fan of Siri. I haven't really honestly adopted Siri. I only trigger it accidentally on the iPhone, but I'm curious to know. I'm curious to know what's new. So, what have you seen?
So, I was really excited about this announcement, and even from the time that we, you and I did some initial sort of run throughs getting ready for this, I've read more about the announcement to try to understand really what it was. And I think it's a little vague. And that may be because the last time they made a big announcement about AI and Siri, they got a big class action lawsuit and, I mean, lost big on that. That was fairly remarkable. So this one, I think, they're sort of indicating there's big things coming, but they're being a far less specific about what those things are. It's more like sort of general capabilities. It'll be able to see what you're doing and enhance it. It's going to be more front and center, and then it's going to be in that dynamic island. There's going to be an app. It's going to have built in, I think the one specific thing I saw was, it's going to be able to help you with your writing wherever, which is like, okay, that feels a little 2022 at this point, but still, good. I'll take that. I mean, I need help with my writing, but overall, I think there's reason to be optimistic that this will really bring a lot to the table and that we will see a lot of innovation here. I think certainly Apple is paying more attention to it. And I sort of expect this to be not triumphant, but I have heard for the last few years what is wrong with Apple's AI strategy. And Apple's not doing anything and they're not being effective. And look, I mean, definitely the last announcement with Siri was a misstep. There's no question about that. I mean, I don't think that looks strategic at all. But Apple has a long history of letting people fight it out, and then they come in and they just take the market. And I think that could easily happen here. They have perhaps the best channel to end users, certainly one of the top ones, them, Google, Facebook have, sort of these most obvious touch points with consumers. But I think Apple particularly is in a great position with the iPhone, the EarPods that I'm using, as well as their emphasis on privacy. So they have this ability to kind of pull a lot of things together with AI in a way that other people don't, and to guarantee usage. So many people are not completely annoyed with Siri. I mean, you sound a little annoyed with it, Diego, but, assuming people have some goodwill there, I think it has a chance to really be successful and really drive a lot of usage for them.
I do want to spend like a minute or two more on Siri because, to my credit, I haven't really fully leveraged it. My use case is to yell out, "Hey Siri," when I lose my phone, and it kind of responds to me, and I find my. So, but going back to like the vision of Siri is really is a personal assistant, and so I have been using ChatGPT, Claude as personal assistants to go run tasks for me. I have not given that responsibility to Siri. I'm curious if that's the direction it wants to take now that these new features seem to allude to the ability to navigate different apps, go to different parts of your phone, maybe pull up like an old photo, create a calendar invite, do things for you, right? So to that note, it's kind of two notes there. One, it's got the real estate, and we've talked about how Fin positioned itself on the customer website. So we're touching on a theme here of like, where does the agent live and what leverage is that giving companies? And has Apple fully leveraged or taken advantage of the real estate they have, or are they waiting? And then the second point, the use cases. And I'm curious, how are you using Siri, and how do you expect this virtual assistant or personal assistant to evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I like what you said there about it being a personal assistant. It obviously has not lived up to that so far. I will say I actually love Siri even in its current incarnation. I know it's limited. I spend so much time in this space, and I have spent so much time in this space that I have heard all the criticisms. And certainly I acknowledge like it seemingly could do a lot more, especially for the past few years. It does seem like a little bit of a missed opportunity. But even in its current form, I mean, I do use it to play music. I use it when I go for bike rides. I like to take notes on audiobooks that I listen to, which I think is just a fantastic use case. I mean, I sort of bike around talking to Siri, saying things about what I just was listening to. And yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic for that. And it's easy to imagine it doing so much more, and it does take me back. I think this is something that maybe we'll go into more depth on in a future episode, Diego, but the sort of history of Siri, I think, is fascinating. And I think particularly Adam Chaya, who led that team for a long time, it had its roots at the Stanford Research Institute, which is where the Siri SRI comes from, went over to Apple. Adam, maybe we can put a link to this in our notes, but Adam, I mean, you can go back many years. He has always had this incredibly crystal clear and I think amazing vision for what Siri should be and what a personal assistant should be. And the idea of something that, you say, oh, I'm running late, so text my wife. I have an appointment conflict, so let Diego know and let's move our one-to-one to a half an hour later. Make an appointment with the dentist, get me tickets for the theater, but don't spend more than $70. Like, I mean, he's had these use cases, I feel like, completely galvanized in his mind. Some of it is kind of obvious because it's essentially, we'd all like to have a personal assistant. And unless you're like Elon Musk, I mean, you don't, but there's a lot of stuff that seemingly these things could take care of for us that would really make our lives easier. And, there's a lot that AI does, but just the personal assistant aspect, I think Apple is uniquely well suited to deliver on that. They have all the data, they have the trust from people by and large. And, the technology certainly seems like it's there. Not quite sure what we can expect in this next release, but it would be easy to imagine maybe not everything I was just describing, but that you're getting closer to that. And I think it's going to be fantastic. And it would also, it does touch upon a second theme that I think we'll return to again, which is what are the channels? How do you get access to people with AI? And as much money as Claude and OpenAI and other companies may raise, as much of a great position as Google is in, owning that phone experience, to me, it's a uniquely valuable piece of real estate that, even if Apple has spent nothing to date, they can easily run away with this and be a huge winner, maybe the biggest winner in consumer AI, just thanks to having that existing relationship.
I think that was really insightful. I can't mention this headline yet because I haven't looked into it, but I saw Elon was kind of flirting with the idea of launching his own phone. But that would be a really good next topic to tie that back in. So
Yeah, I would. Just what he'll call it alone. I mean, there's probably like 4 or 5 stories there that are worth talking about. I mean, the
yeah,
naming will
yeah. So,
be
but
fascinating.
we've got another one on our list, and this is sort of going back into the contact center realm. So Amazon announced a new UI for their Connect. I think one of the key takeaways here is that it's catering more towards business users as opposed to your typical engineers. So there's an emphasis on low code, no code, helping non-technical people get to production faster. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
So this, I do think, gets more into our core competency as a business around, helping people to deliver great voice experiences. because yes, I think this was part of an acquisition that Amazon did. I think it was, I think it was a good acquisition. I think this is going to be good for Amazon Connect users. And I guess, the sort of things I've seen from Amazon Connect in the last 6 months, there's been some other news stories, and they seem to really be pushing it in a few different directions rather aggressively that I think are, make sense to me. I think that's all good. At the same time, I did go back and I looked through the history of no code tools being announced as part of Amazon Connect. And I mean, even with a brief look back, you can find in 2022, they were touting Lex being no code. And Amazon Lex had, I think even going back to like 2018 or 2019, that was being integrated into Amazon Connect as a simpler way to build things, maybe more oriented towards developers, but still had a no code, sort of low code story there. But in 2022, they're sort of really emphasizing that part because they added more. They basically added the workflow diagram type tooling that, many people are familiar with. Then they went in 2023, introduced that functionality into Connect, which at the time I was kind of scratching my head over that one because it looked, it's like, why do you need two workflow tools? And Connect was by no means a sophisticated NLU. Arguably Lex was not either, but there was some NLU capability. It seemed very duplicative. And then with this announcement in 2026, it does sort of seem like, look, I mean, you guys have frittered away some time here. And I do think, when the AI push was really starting, I mean, when ChatGPT was obviously such a major event when that came out and sort of changed the world seemingly, I really thought, well, Amazon's going to crush it with Connect. And for the same reason I was just saying with Apple, because it has such a great channel. Amazon has, or in my perception, had great AI. And then they have this great channel in a CCaaS, contact center as a service, with Amazon Connect. And so you marry those two things together and you have this incredible ability to deliver new AI experiences to end users. And I do think having that channel and the technology together is going to be, when I think the sort of growing pains that I anticipate for our industry in the next few years, just that simple equation, I think, is going to be such a barrier. But I didn't think it, I thought, well, this is where Amazon's going to crush everybody. It seems like they're kind of spinning their wheels. And it's kind of surprising. Google, they didn't opt to build or buy a CCaaS. They didn't seem to want to do that. There's a lot of CCaaS providers that we know well, the Genesis, Five9, NICE, other players that are out there. They don't have the same history with building out AI solutions. And I'm not saying that they can't. They're all working hard on it. NICE made an acquisition with Cognigy that was impressive, et cetera, et cetera. But NICE did not have, as Amazon did, 10,000 engineers working on Amazon Alexa, working on a voice AI product in-house that seemingly could be very quickly repurposed to deliver generative AI into these experiences. So, I mean, the channel story to hear to me is interesting, but I think also, there is an aspect, and I want to phrase this, I guess, diplomatically, because I don't want to sound too critical, but there's a part of it where I feel like Amazon squandered some advantages. And even part of me where I think Amazon has been the best technology company for 16 odd years running. They've delivered technology at scale via AWS far better than anyone else out there. Has their model sort of met its match with AI? And without going on too long here, the last thought is, I think what has made Amazon so great as a technology company is they're super customer focused. Everybody knows that. And they hire incredibly bright people. And it's just like, let's solve these problems. But, as opposed to somebody like Google that is definitely not as much customer focused. I think some people could say it's almost customer allergic. They don't really like talking to people, sort of famously. I don't think I'm being overly critical to say that. But they are much better at R&D. Right. And so is the lack of emphasis, the lack of culture around R&D at Amazon sort of holding them back? That's a theory I have, but either way, it does seem like they've squandered a little bit of an opportunity here in 2026 to just be bringing in a technology, NLX, which was a very well-respected company, but it's not frontier models. It's not a frontier technology. It does look like they've missed out a little bit.
That's really interesting. From my perspective, what I'm seeing as well is this when you cater to a new end user, let's say the business analyst, and giving him the tools to run with the project and not rely on engineers. I've seen the story on a bit of a different angle, more from like an app development, people building apps. We've seen the vibe coding wave. First, we saw the promise of visual development. So you had platforms like Bubble, which let you put the logic pieces and then build a UI and a backend, and you've launched an app. And then that got steamrolled by vibe coding, like Lovable. You just prompt your app idea. And we've seen the promise, and we've also seen the reality of, you've given this superpower to people that are not trained to be engineers, and they suddenly discover security issues. And I've seen that story play out in that world. I'm curious how that plays out in the enterprise, and what are the sort of wake up or reality checks that happen in the next few years when we do democratize access to building these systems. I'm curious whether you've seen sort of that trend as well.
I think that that's a great question. I think that that's one that hasn't been answered well. Well, so we do have some early returns on it, in the sense on the chatbot side. My impression is that they were just sort of turned loose. I mean, there was a wave of innovation that sort of transformed everybody's chatbots, everybody's customer support bots. And it happened. I mean, I'm not saying everybody has replaced the bots on their website, but the quality of answer you now get from those little chatbots that live in the same place as Intercom did, and a lot of times still is Intercom, or it's a new type of widget, or it's, you're going to a separate website for customer support, but whatever it is, the chatbot Gen AI RAG model experience is amazing. I mean, things that would have been tickets or hours of searching through help documentation are now resolved in about 10 seconds. And so that, I think, was transformative. And at the same time, from where we were sitting, we didn't see a lot of concern around, does this work right? Does it ever make mistakes? Most people seem to be very tolerant of errors with it, as long as the containment rate was up, meaning that, end users were able to resolve their queries without having to talk to a human being. And presumably, I don't know how closely people were watching it, but presumably that the NPS scores weren't sinking, which I don't think they were. I mean, like, for many of the people we work with, my delight with these products has gone way up, because you don't have to open a ticket. You don't have to wait for someone. You don't have to look through tons of documentation. And I do see sometimes, not that often actually, make terrible errors, but yeah, it doesn't seem to bother anyone. That's one result. Will it be the same for other applications of AI? Because, these are basically glorified FAQs and documentation bots. I don't know.
That's interesting. And I think the pace of, they're going beyond RAG now with the MCPs, they're going out and doing things. It just opens up a whole layer of things to consider. So that's a great segue actually to this next headline, ElevenLabs and the resurgence of procedures.
Yeah, I love this story. I mean, ElevenLabs announcing their new product, Procedures, which to me, I did a lot of work on this. I actually had a company around this. It looks like a rules-based system. So it is a structured approach to encoding policy in plain language. And, I think it's a good way to encode policies. It's a good way to encode guardrails. It seems like, I don't think they've been adopted necessarily at scale yet, but it seems like this may be, to the question you were just posing, Diego, for things that are more sensitive, for things that have more of a sort of regulatory overhang. If you deploy a chatbot that answers questions about how do you use an API and it doesn't answer right, big deal if it gets wrong. If you're a bank deploying a customer support bot and it's answering a question about somebody's mortgage policy, or if it's making an underwriting decision about whether or not somebody should get a loan, if it's an insurance company deciding whether or not somebody should be insured, or whether or not something is covered, these are questions that presumably, well, not presumably, but they have far more implications legally as well as reputationally for companies. And rules-based systems, when I worked on them, I don't want to say when, but it was in a previous previous wave of AI that was less successful, you know, they were seen as a natural solution because the problem people were always trying to solve was like, you know, we have these complex policies and we want the people that are the experts in the policy to be able to manage it. And this procedures looks like exactly that type of tool. Let's let the sort of subject matter experts own the policy. And I think to give Amazon kudos for something, because we are sort of being a little bit negative towards them in that last story, I will say they put out a great paper on an approach to turning policy, essentially turning it into mathematical, logical expressions. We should provide a link to this too. I'm not going to do it justice in terms of summarizing exactly how they're doing it, but you know, essentially, people. The gist of it is express your policy in plain English, leverage generative AI to transform it into a mathematical equation, do testing on it to ensure that that transformation step was correct, as well as that, you know, I mean, having worked in rules-based systems, one of the things that we learned, and like my partner, who's the former CEO of a major mortgage company, can talk about, what you'd find with these rules-based systems is that the policies were in contradiction to each other. They could, you know, for 20 years, people could have policies around what your underwriting is, what your securitization is. You know, banks could live with these policies that were in direct contradiction for each other, but you wouldn't know that because, you know, it might be thousands of pages you have to go through to find those contradictions. And so it wasn't easy to identify them. So that's something people have to kind of work through as they get to that. But the direction to me makes a lot of sense, that you have an LLM that can answer things, but then is supervised by a rules-based system. And that's what this procedures kind of looks like to me. And I think it's cool. So I'm really interested to see where this goes. And I'm also just grateful that, in a sense, that it sort of makes some sense out of part of my career that to me looked like kind of a weird detour. It definitely, some people would tout rules-based systems as AI at the time. And I was like, it doesn't seem that smart. So hopefully they'll be smarter this time around.
I could keep talking about that. At some point, maybe in a future episode, we could dive deeper into what lessons or obstacles could you see in that wave of AI happening or resurging in this wave? And are we in a bubble? And go into that. But it'd be interesting to save that for another time.
I feel like the bubble should be on a list of verboten subjects.
Yeah.
Not because I don't like it, but I will say that if you have a beer with me, I like to make predictions about whether or not we're in a bubble. But I mean, I've just heard the bubble conversation so many times that it's like, yeah, I guess it's hard to say. Regarding ElevenLabs, I will say they are another company and another theme that I think we'll be returning to. They, along with Sierra, to me, have done this great job of sort of getting out there. I haven't seen a lot of customers yet using their stuff. I know they do have great customers, but I do think it's somewhat early for them. But just in terms of how they've shaped the conversation, their influence in the market, the sort of mind share that they have amongst developers and business users, I think it's amazing. I've enjoyed listening to the CEO of ElevenLabs when he's appeared on podcasts. Seems like a very sharp guy. So I thought this was a great announcement. It's a little bit technical, but I think it's a good one. It seems like a good product release, and you know, we're interested to see where it goes. And I guess one other thing that will kind of tie this into a final point that we're making, but I think this enables testing. So one thing I've been worried about from the very onset of LMs and generative AI is, how do you test it when the behavior is so non-deterministic? Well, if you have a policy encoded in natural language, you know, that is explicit, that does express these are the constraints on the system, these are the things that it should do and it should not do, well, that becomes your test bed. And that becomes a tool that we, as a company that is built around QA, you know, we can really go to town with. So from that perspective, I think it's also a great boon. It makes these things that have seemed a little scary, a little non-deterministic, and potentially erratic. It holds the promise that they will be much less so. So I'm really interested to see where this part goes. To me, this points the direction to the future for how this stuff really moves into production in the sort of highly regulated industries that we work with.
And I think it's also a good segue into the ElevenLabs announcement made at CCW that I saw last week. They had a partnership with TELUS Digital, and the use case was very interesting. If I understood it correctly, it was about using ElevenLabs to simulate calls with agents that are being onboarded
Oh yeah.
and ramp up that time that it takes for them to get the training they need to go out and face real customers. That's what I understood as the use case there. And so in that sense, they simulated, human bot interactions, conversations, and basically sped up that onboarding period by 20%. So I thought that was really interesting. It's also just one of several use cases that we've heard about coming out of 11 Labs. So very interesting to see that.
Yeah, I had heard about that one from some folks at TELUS. I think that's really cool. And that's,
Yeah.
that's one of those use cases in AI where you're just like, I never would have thought of that, but it sounds great. And, sounds potentially like it's a lot better than what people might have done before.
And on CCW, there was just a lot to talk about. I mean, there were about 300 booths. So exhibitors all involved, whether in CCAS or in workforce management, a lot of agent assist as well. But on the voice AI space, what I'm hearing, what I've seen is just an emphasis on, getting to production, no longer staying in the pilot phase. That's been sort of the drum being beat this year. And at least on the QA perspective, we have a firsthand look at that. And still, we do have cases where we've seen projects being invested in and then having to be cut because it didn't meet that quality threshold
Yeah.
that gives them that confidence to launch. So um, I can't say that I've been able to pinpoint any success story as of yet that's compelling, but there just seems to be a lot of enthusiasm around getting to production, and people are really taking the guardrail conversation seriously. So I would say a lot of the programming was around guardrails, governance, and I don't see QA being explicitly said, but in the context of these procedures and making sure your agent is following some set of rules, that seems to be the major trend.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting that you say that guardrails were a big point of conversation. I mean, who seemed to be sort of moving the fastest? I mean, what was the sort of most innovative vendor or use case that you saw on display?
I personally thought Sierra was very compelling, very full stack. It was one of the largest booths, and I guess their sales team was really well versed, very enthusiastic as well. So that you left their booth feeling like, wow, they are here for the taking. And then
Yeah.
you know, much different energy than when I would go to, let's say, a Genesis. Genesis was the other one that was like took up the majority of the expo hall, and they were doing lots of demos as well. But what I would highlight is, of all these, I would call them like the contact center AI, Sierra, and 11 Labs too, but there was also another one. The name is escaping me right now, but their booth sort of highlighted this all-in-one sort of conversation. You have your AI agents doing QA. You have
Yep.
back to the point of what I'm seeing about the UI shifting around who they're anticipating the user to be, and increasingly the talk around non-technical users. I saw a demo from Vappy, for example. Vappy allows you to build your voice agent. It has a section for simulating conversations, but it's a vibe code product. So you need to vibe, you need to prompt your expected personas. I kind of see their thinking, but I don't know how actual like intuitive that is. So you describe it out and it gets to work. So you no longer have to like do things. And I guess that's what I'm seeing being a trend as well. And I know I haven't answered your question about which one blew my mind away. I think the one that the demo was most impressive is probably SoundHound's Amelia. I really respect their UI, and
Hmm.
just the solution engineers are very well versed and walk you through everything. And I thought that was very impressive. Whereas Sierra, perhaps because I was a vendor, but even not a competitive vendor, I didn't get a real look into their product. But Amelia and Soundhound, they really go into detail about the ins and out of their product. So yeah, that's been a bit about my impressions on the expo floor.
It's interesting that you mentioned Amelia because that was an acquisition by SoundHound, and I was just looking it up. That was formerly known as IPsoft, which was founded in 1998, and they've been in this space forever. So kudos to them, I guess, for staying up to date and refreshing the technology. I certainly do have regard for those players that have been around for some time and do know, now that we've worked in the contact center for a number of years, there are a lot of tricks to it that you have to know. It's not to say that there's not room for a lot of new technology, but there's stuff, that we've seen customers really struggle with, like alphanumeric codes, recognizing people's names, these sort of classic thorny speech recognition issues that you can't just assume that the new stuff solves. And so there is a part where the new vendors have to kind of learn about the space, and obviously some of the older vendors, they need to refresh their stacks. The other thing that what you're talking about there gets me thinking about is, like, I mean, you say Genesis and Sierra, that to me is such a great, contrast between those two. I mean, Genesis, they are in such a great position in terms of the channel. They are in this dominant position in terms of their market share in the CCAS space. For so many people, if you want to go live with AI, you're going to have to do it through them. And I don't, they do have an offering, but they haven't moved incredibly quickly to refresh their stack for Gen AI. So they've got the channel, but they don't necessarily have the latest technology yet ready for people to use. And then Sierra, you're talking about them, Diego. I mean, and I have not seen a Sierra demo, so I should be careful, but I do kind of assume, they have $800 million. They probably built out some pretty good software, and they sound like they know what they're doing. So they've got the newer technology. They've got some of the expertise. They've got this forward deployed engineer model, which to me does make a lot of sense for these implementations. But then how do they deliver it? I mean, a lot of it kind of has to go through Genesis. So I don't know how, maybe those two booths were talking. Maybe they're figuring something out. But it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, because people want this technology, and it's still getting figured out how exactly it's going to land on people's desktops.
Yeah, that really brings me back to remembering it was Happy Robot was the one that I forgot, but their booth laid out, their full stack, everything in one. But you're right, the expo floor for that was on one side Amazon Connect and Genesis, on the other side it was Sierra, Finn, ElevenLabs, and Happy Robot, and SoundHound as well. SoundHound, Amelia. Another thing worth noting there is we started to see them come up a lot, and especially on the drive-through headlines. So I think that's a bit of a shout out to our next episode on drive-throughs and the history of the AI use case there. So we've started to see them pop up as well. And I think what you're laid out there is totally true. The tech and channel, and the ones that have the channel, but they're catching up with the tech. So I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so something I wanted to share that I learned this week was a customer wanted us to help them with an agentic AI implementation and to get a head start on their testing and some simulations for it. But all they had as artifacts to document it so far are some PNG flowcharts. And, when they first mentioned this to us, I thought, well, I don't know if that's going to work or not. I don't know if that's something that we can really leverage as a way to start doing some in-depth testing on this system. But, we ran it through, I ran it through Gemini. Another engineer on our team, I think, used Claude, and it did a great job. So I was impressed. I mean, that this, the system was able to essentially take just a flow chart that's a graphical image and basically turn it into a pretty darn good JSON file that then we could leverage to generate tests. So it's useful to us. It's one more thing that we can offer to our customers. I mean, a point that they're always concerned about is, how do we get started quickly? How do we get started with existing artifacts that we have so that we can sort of jumpstart our QA? And it's nice that this is now another route that's available. So I thought that was, it was neat. It was practical and also kind of amazing. I mean, I'm always impressed by what generative AI can do. And this is one more use case that I thought was really pretty neat.
I think that's it's really exciting. In my conversations with prospects, getting started is I think the hardest part. And every person has a different set of baseline. Some people have those artifacts and some people don't. So that is really cool to see how that's being addressed. I think we covered a lot today, and I'm very excited to keep the conversation going. So this was our first run at this, and we still don't have a podcast name besides the Bespoken AI show. So if you have ideas, feel free to comment, and please be sure to follow us on LinkedIn. We appreciate you joining the conversation. And if you have some things to say about anything we touched on, reach out. Maybe we could have you on. So, John, if you have any parting words.
Well, I guess, I mean, just on that end, I mean, this is something that, we want this to be timely and of the moment. And part of what's timely or of the moment is us figuring out what we want to do with the show. So if you have suggestions on things you'd like to see us cover, we do like talking about the news. I think that the developments that are happening in AI, I mean, they're just amazing. And so certainly part of our inspiration for doing this, I really like the 20 VC show where they talk about the latest developments. It's just amazing. It's a really exciting time generally in technology. I think particularly for our space of voice AI, it's more exciting than I ever thought it would be in the time that I've spent in it. So it's really cool. So talking about developments, I think is obviously, that's something we wanted to do, but then we were planning on doing some things in which we do sort of history or sort of reviewing stuff that's happened and some of how the technology has come to be. We find that to be sort of compelling, and we've got some ideas there, as Diego was mentioning, talking about the history of voice AI and fast food drive-through ordering, going through some use cases that we see, as well as having on guests. So those are some of our ideas for where we could see this going. But if you have any thoughts, we appreciate them.
Thanks a lot, John, and thank you for listening. Until next time.
Thanks a lot.